Hello out there, all you wonderful people. This is Andre, the Game Idea Guy. Thank you once again for lending me your time and your ear, listening into another Gamer's Thoughts discussion, and happy Halloween to everyone. This particular video discussion is going to be involving video game franchises that could also work as horror titles. And some of these people will probably think right off the bat, yeah, that makes sense. And then I know a couple of them, people are going to question my sanity. But that's the whole purpose of this, is to show people that, hey, maybe there's a little bit of a twist that can be made to something that you don't expect that could actually fit within horror. And when I say horror, I don't specifically mean survival horror. I just mean things that are thought to be inconceivable and untoward someone's fragile mind. Something that could generally break a person's mind if they took the time to think about it in a different perspective. So, with that said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the first game of 10. So let's talk about Mass Effect. There are several points in the timeline of Mass Effect that would make for great horror games, but none would be better than the beginning of the Rachni Wars, the time period before the Solarians gave advanced technology to the Krogans and ended up using them as a blunt instrument to take down the Rachni. The various systems and planets that they made their way to were being overrun. The Asari, Turians, Solarians, and however few Quarians there were out and about at the time had to deal with the waves and droves of Rachni. All that would really need to be done is having a compelling story told from the perspective of any character from one of those races. Just on one planet, a swarm happens, resources become hard to acquire, and the goal of the game is to survive the onslaught and make it off the planet. This could be done with several small campaigns or one large one. Either way, it would be very easy to use the Rachni at a similar capacity as xenomorphs from Aliens, and to make them just as vicious and cunning. And honestly, I would love to see it happen if EA would be willing to give BioWare the leeway to do so. So let's talk about The Legend of Zelda. For this series in particular, there are multiple points in any of the games that could be used to create a horror scenario that could be both interesting and extremely terrifying, especially if you provide it from the perspective of someone who isn't Link. But even as Link, there can be some moments that are bone-chilling if represented in the right context. Tears of the Kingdom provided that with the many different creatures that look like they came right out of an eldritch horror story, but it definitely isn't the first time this was done with the series. Dead Hand, Bongo Bongo, Re-Deads, the Stalfos, those are some that can be named off the top of my head that really drive this idea home. And even depending on the context of the story and situation, Dark Link or Shadow Link can be presented a far more sinister and horrific light. The Legend of Zelda series has always been filled with the stuff of nightmares. So let's talk about Twisted Metal. My favorite card combat franchise growing up. I would love to see this game series get an entry that is more horror. And it can be done if Twisted Metal Black is anything to go off of. It will require that whoever they have work on the game start to create more NPC character types, which honestly wouldn't be a bad thing when you consider how powerful Calypso is and what he can make happen. Having to battle hordes of undead machines, then facing off against one of the racers in a demented mental state could be a very cool concept and would easily be able to fall into the horror spectrum if it was done right. And it's not like the series is a major leap away from that being able to happen and it being fully cemented as a horror game. I'd be up for it. Let's talk about Dragon Age. As a minor fan of the Dragon Age series, I would really like to see what they could do with the more chilling aspects of the story and world. And for that, I would love to see what the first Blight was like before the creation of the Grey Wardens. There is no way that they could have been around when the first blight happened because they needed darkspawn blood in order to perform the ritual that creates Grey Wardens. So I could see a story with normal people who had to suffer that situation, how it could be horrifically scary under the right circumstances. Maybe even a story of the first true Grey Warden and how that person became what was needed to save the land. Obviously, things would start before this person becomes the first Grey Warden, trying to find a way to get rid of the blight and surviving and struggling through it with little to no available resources, eventually becoming the catalyst to turn things around. That could be pretty cool. So let's talk about Knights. Knights is another game that could easily fall into the realm of horror just based upon its premise. The games take place in the world of dreams. People's minds and energy are stolen in said dreams, which essentially kills them. If the character Knights itself would have actually fulfilled the role its creator wanted for it, then we'd essentially see a situation where the humans that were captured in the world of dreams basically would never awaken. They would be trapped in horrible nightmares until their body just finally extinguished. That's a very dreadful thought. That kind of makes me want to see what that world would look like. And I mean, it's not like Sega's unknown when it comes down to horror. It could be a cool concept to try out. So let's talk about Final Fantasy. Now, if I really have to explain to anyone how Final Fantasy as a franchise could quickly and easily be turned into a horror story, people really haven't played enough of the games or paid any attention to the stories. Nearly everything in the franchise is world ending, but you also have creatures like zombies, werewolves, evil eyes, and abominations of all kinds. They are a staple for the series. The worst one in most of the games being the Tonberries because of their slow shuffle towards you and proclivity to end you with one hit, usually a shank. It would be interesting to see Square just dedicate the game to that type of vibe throughout the entirety of it. I mean, it's in them to do so, and I don't remember a Final Fantasy on record specifically set to be horror, just that they have horror elements. So hey, Square Enix, go ahead, give it a shot. So let's talk about Pokemon. I know there has to be at least one person who tilted their head at this idea, but the honest truth is, there are plenty of ways to actually make the story of Pokemon into a horror franchise. Whether you look towards Lavender Town with issues surrounding the notably dead Pokemon that can resurface as ghosts, or the strange and noticeable ambience of the location, or beyond that to the various legendary Pokemon that have the potential to end the world, with one even coming from a reflected version of the universe where everything else but itself is dead. There is always something that could come from the franchise that could lead to a world-ending event under different circumstances. And what's scarier than that? Be honest with yourself. So let's talk about Mega Man X. This is probably an entry that people would be questioning at first glance. You probably wouldn't see anything that would lend itself to horror with this franchise, but the X series has enough elements in it to create a horror series from it, if only a couple of events are changed. And the one thing that would really need to change for this to work well is how the Maverick virus operates. In the Mega Man X series, the virus really just messes with the thought processes of Reploids in the story, making them more susceptible to judgment changes and errors in their thought processes. It alters the chemistry of their electronic brains. Now, if we were to say, introduce the element of the virus overloading their systems and energy output, which will cause degrading of their bodies and systems, that could very well lead to a horror scenario in that world. It would actually create a dystopian world very similar to that of the Casher and Sins anime. But along with the physical degradation of the Reploids, their minds would deteriorate as well, leaving them trying to spread the virus, but also losing their sense of reason along the way. That could make for a great story, and we would have a legitimate robot zombie apocalypse. So let's talk about Metroid. There are tons of ways that horror games could be created based upon the Metroid franchise. A psychological horror game could be made based upon Samus's time in the coma after she was attacked by the X-Parasites. You can make a game based upon the perspective of the space pirates running and trying to escape Samus. You could even make a game based on the idea that one of the SAX clones from the space station in Metroid Fusion survived and began hunting down soldiers from the Galactic Federation, or even some of the other known bounty hunters from the series. One way or the other, there are plenty of elements from Metroid that would lead to that type of game for the series, and it could be great. And I think I did talk about the game idea from the perspective of the space pirates. It's a good listen. So let's talk about Shinobi. There are many different points in the Shinobi franchise where it could become a horror scenario instead of the purely action-based game series that we got. But I will focus on Shinobi for the PS2 specifically, as this game is filled with horror type elements. With the many dilapidated areas that you come into contact with, it would be very easy to imagine a situation in which the normal people of Tokyo were running for their lives, trying to hide, trying to survive. Or even the lesser members of the Oboro clan that weren't as well trained as someone like Hatsuma, how the situation would affect them. Sure, they could put up a fight, but they would likely get overwhelmed in a situation where Hatsuma thrives. There's definitely room for that type of story in the series, which I would personally love to see. And it would be interesting. So there you have it, folks. 10 video game franchises that could work in the horror genre that aren't specifically a part of it. And if there's any that anybody would like to add in the comments or wherever you hear this, like Spotify, if you want to talk about it, please do. I would love to hear some other franchises people would think would fit very well into the horror aesthetic. This is Halloween anyway, and I would thoroughly enjoy going through these comments and seeing what people say and think. Anyway, thank you guys very much for listening, and keep your eyes and ears out for more stuff from me, and until the next time, enjoy your games. Peace out, everybody.